Hello there, and welcome back once again to another episode of Three Guys and the Word. It is great to be among you once again. We went on a little bit of hiatus, but we are back, ready to open up a new discussion from a new book from God's Word. Looking very much forward to this new series, and we're going to go over what we're going to be talking about in just a moment, but it's always just great to be among you, to be able to open up the Word of God and seek to better understand what it says and what God has desire for all of us to do in this life in order to attain the next. And as always, joining me are my fellow brothers in Christ, fellow evangelists, fellow workers in the field. And it's great to see you, both Chris and Eric, and look very much forward to what we're going to be talking about. But Eric, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good. I've seen you a few times during our hiatus, but I haven't seen Chris.
Oh.
So it's good to see Chris, and definitely looking forward to the next chapter, the next book. I guess the next chapter will be a few weeks, but the next book that we're taking a look at. So it's always exciting to have these opportunities to talk with two other preachers. A lot of times I spend, I might comb books and things and comb different people's thoughts and things, but as far as an active discussion with two other preachers, it's definitely, as Chris would say, a highlight of the week, and really excited about it. So, Chris, how you doing, man?
Good. It's a highlight of the week. uh, to me, it's like the last few Thursdays. I've been like, man, what am I going to do this morning? Trying to
Yeah.
find stuff to keep me busy. I missed it. But looking forward to what we're doing. Like I was telling Andrew before we started, been pretty busy, but that's a good thing. We're into the Psalms in my Messianic prophecy class. I think it's the 15th one. So, as I warned everyone last night, we got about 400 more slides left, so you better buckle in. But kind of what we're going to do, I think, from our discussion here is the Old and New Testament have value, and that's something that hopefully I'm sure that you guys would say the same thing. Maybe we can hopefully through the study we're doing this time, uh, maybe pique someone's curiosity to look at the Old Testament a little bit better because there is a lot of value in it, and I'm really looking forward to doing this. You doing all right, Andrew?
Well, as I was talking to you before the uh, beginning of our episode, I had a loved one pass away, and it very much connects to very well with what we're going to be talking about today and throughout what we're going to be discussing in this next book. And it just hopefully is just a sobering aspect when you're looking at life, and then you have another appreciation for when death comes, and when you study from what we're going to be studying, it hopefully just makes this life and what we're doing much more important, and puts the right perspective on things as we seek to do what we need to do, and what the meaning of life is all about. Because when you come to the end of one's life, you generally reflect upon, okay, why am I here? And what we're going to be talking about really hits that. And it's very much gets to that point. And so without further delay, I've been putting all these dots and all these cliffhangers about what we're going to be talking about. We hope that you have your Bibles with you, and that we're going to be discussing the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you're not knowledgeable of where the book of Ecclesiastes is, it's part of the wisdom literature. It is in the Old Testament. It's like the midway point. There's Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and then the book of Ecclesiastes. And then right after that would be the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. But it's one of those books that has an interesting title. You're just like saying, like, well, what does that mean? And we'll get that into a moment. But before we actually start diving into the discussion and just going around and giving our first impressions of what the book and what we hope to gain from this study, we have a new principal verse that we want to highlight and kind of center our thoughts as to why we're doing what we're doing. And if Chris, you'd be so kind as to read our new principal verses.
We'll be reading through this section, going through Ecclesiastes. Our principal verse will be Romans chapter 10, verses 14 through 15, which we went over last time, the book of Romans. But it says, "How then shall they call on him whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things," which is a quotation from Isaiah 52. But so you have New Testament Paul quoting that to New Testament Christians, but also that quotations in the Old Testament. So I know going through this book, I think we're going to get a lot that we can use too, like Andrew had highlighted.
So, Chris, just first impressions about before we really start talking and reading passages in this first chapter, just your first initial thoughts of the book and what you hope to gain, what to expect. Just quick overall overview, if you'd like to just add your thoughts real quick.
You know, you read of Solomon, asked for wisdom from God, and he also had pretty much everything you could ask for. And you read this book and you're like, how are you so negative about everything? Like, this is worthless. This means nothing. So reading through it the first time I ever did, I was like, man, this is really negative. But kind of reading through it other times, it kind of just points out a lot of times we get caught up in all these physical blessings and we become reliant on those things. I don't think Solomon's really necessarily just being a negative, cynical old man when he writes his book. He's lived it and he understands that those things don't have eternal value. And I think, I think it would be helpful for those listening. I know that when we had decided to do this, I went back and read other places about Solomon to try to understand Solomon a little bit better, of him being the writer of this, just to understand his life, to understand his background. I think that could be really helpful. But one thing I kind of want to get out of this book, I just want to have a greater appreciation of purpose. I think everyone is striving in life to find their purpose, and Solomon goes through every possible route to do that. And at the end of the book, he'll kind of tell us what we need to do. I don't want to spoil it, but he kind of does an experiment so that we don't have to experiment. It's kind of the way I would kind of view that. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the same idea that I would get across. I think it's pretty common to view Solomon as the writer, I think for good reason. There are some difficulties to that. He doesn't actually say, this is Solomon writing a letter or writing the book. The term that's used is Koheleth in Hebrew, and in Greek it's Ecclesiastes. So it's somebody who stands before a preacher, or stands before a congregation, I should say, stands before an assembly of people. So that's the designation he gives to himself. But when you think about somebody who is a son of David, and you think about somebody who had all the abilities to acquire the things that is talked about in this book, I mean, Solomon's pretty much your go-to example. And it sounds a lot like some of the things that we know Solomon did write in the Old Testament. So that's, why that conclusion has been drawn. But really, the big message for Ecclesiastes is, you can have everything in the world, but if you don't have God, then it doesn't matter. And he's going to return to that over and over again, that idea of vanity of vanities, futility of futilities, life under the sun. Life under the sun is sort of this idea that you're just looking at the physical things and you're not considering God. He's going to get his conclusion at the very end, of course, talking about fearing God, but fearing God and revering him. So really good stuff here. Very practical, great, I think, illustration that you gave, Chris. That Solomon, he does the experiment, and he shows that you get everything in the world, and if you don't have God, it doesn't matter. So make sure you have God, and if you have other things, great. I mean, if you got a good job, then rejoice in that. Rejoice in the work of your hands. If you have a good woman, good wife, if you're a man, then rejoice in her. If you have food, rejoice in that. If you have shelter, rejoice in that. If you're young, then great. Celebrate your youth. But at the end of the day, those things only have true meaning if God is in your life, and if God is not in your life, then it's meaningless. Now, y'all know Scott Byer, here in Louisville. He's a preacher, and I was talking to him one time about evangelism and what's his method of sort of sharing the gospel with people. And he actually said that he starts with Ecclesiastes, and says that Ecclesiastes sort of pulls away the veil and says, if only I could just have such and such, then I'd be happy. He says he starts with Ecclesiastes, and he shows people you're not going to be happy unless you have God. And you're not going to have, true joy, lasting joy, and peace and comfort and hope unless you have God in your life. So you read from Romans 10, 14, and 15, Chris, and that's a perfect passage for this, because oftentimes we think of the gospel exclusive to the New Testament, but the Old Testament was pointing people to a relationship with God too. And in that sense, the Old Testament offered good news as well, and that was beautiful for people, and it should be well received. Andrew?
I was picking up on what you just said. There's multiple passages. One in particular we read fairly recent, Romans 15 and verse 4, about the Old Testament scriptures being profitable, and that's used for our learning, and we need to make sure that we give attention to it. And we may not be under the law of Moses anymore, but we still have many principles that are still intact to this very day. And a passage that we very much are committed to our memory of 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17, about just all scriptures God breathed and profitable for teaching. It's complete for righteousness' sake, and for equip us for every good work. And that was talking about of course, what they had at the time. Not all of the New Testament was yet penned, and so that would certainly include the Old Testament scriptures. And we just need to remember that the old is not done away with in the sense of needing to learn from it, to study from it. And there's so many principles, as we will see throughout the text in this book. And hopefully those that are watching will gain much from this study. And I'm looking forward to it. And I'm going to go ahead and just read the first two verses. And we're just going to start really talking about it, because it's going to lay down his point and really hit home with a real powerful introductory statement that when you think of Hebrew poetry, that's right here. This is part of it. And so it's not like the way we would necessarily see or think of poetry in the way that we would read it, but it's very beautiful of how it should make us want to think and dive deeper into what is being said. So just for the first two verses of chapter 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now, as we've already indicated, he calls himself the preacher. He's very much worthy of being someone who is capable of teaching, especially from life experience. As Chris said, if you look and study his life, what he was able to gain from God, the gift of wisdom. There were periods, of course, where he used it appropriately and wisely, because he was given that godly wisdom. And then there was no doubt, and he will put it in this text as we look throughout. You'll see how he's applied it wisely, and then he applies it foolishly. There's no doubt in my mind that this is Solomon, and there's a good reason for that. One meaning in Jerusalem, and as we will see, just further descriptions, not only being a son of David, being king in Jerusalem, and so that there will be other things that we can point to that will give us good reason to say that yes, this is Solomon, and just the way that he talks and gives and the way he writes. But I find it, before I turn it over to Chris, this word vanity, the Hebrew, and one of our elders not too long ago pointed this out. The Hebrew word means breath or vapor. So if you think of breath or vapor, they don't last very long. It's very fleeting, and that hopefully that should give us some indication of the better, like, visual aid or a thought in our mind, more concrete idea of what Solomon is going to be getting towards. Something that doesn't, of course, last. There's this idea of futility, emptiness also towards this meaning. But if you think about it, when it comes to Hebrew, there's a lot more concrete imagery to an idea that is presented. So it can benefit and give us what some people say more color to a passage, and illustrate for us. So you think about something that is just fleeting, that is coming away, or just going to be short-lived. James, the writer in his letter in the New Testament, had this idea about life as mere vapor. Same idea. So much more could be said, but I want to turn it over to Chris, and just your initial thoughts on these first two verses.
What an introduction in verse 1. That would really grab your attention. The words of the preacher, the son of David. This is, that phrase, son of David, even Jesus uses that to describe himself, this being in the immediate context of being Solomon. But to say I'm the son of King David, okay, well, wait a minute, we probably need to stop and listen. And then not only that, I myself, I'm a king in Jerusalem. Reading about Solomon, 1 Kings chapter 2 through chapter 12, 2 Chronicles chapter 1 through 9, you can read more about Solomon if you're interested in him. Solomon's a really interesting person. Like we had talked about in Romans 16 when we went through the list of the individuals that Paul had talked about. It's just not a list of names. These were real people. Solomon was a real person who had real problems, who had real issues. He had highs as a king, and he had highs in his service to God. But just like his dad, David, he had a lot of lows too. And Solomon, I think, probably writes this in his older age after he's experienced all these different things. And how much of a blessing is it for us that we can read this and say, okay, Solomon made this mistake, that mistake, this one. I don't have to make that mistake. For a lot of people, they have to make the mistake before they learn from it. But for us as Christians, we can read of mistakes in the past that other people have made, and we don't have to make them. So to me, I think you start out and you think of the person that Solomon is. I don't know about you guys, reading through Ecclesiastes, he is very carnally minded in a lot of places. In a lot of ways, it kind of reads maybe like an atheist mindset, you would think, of him focusing so much on the physical. He makes mentions of God, but it's not necessarily as reverent as you would expect from someone that had asked God for wisdom. But I think really what he tries to bring out in this book, like Andrew pointed out with the vanity aspect, he's trying to drive the point home to us. Hey, I've tried all of it. It's worthless. It's meaningless. Like Eric said, apart from God, if you don't have God, all those other things are worthless. You can't take your riches with you when you die. You can't take your possessions when you die. And that phrase vanity, vanity, vanities, everything's it's a common theme. And typically when someone repeats something numerous times, they're probably trying to get a point across. So, like I said, the first time I read it, I'm like, man, this is a really negative book. But I think as you see, it's not necessarily, oh, everything is just worthless. Everything is just meaningless. Like Eric had said, once you get to the end of the book and you see that connection, it's almost like what we said with Romans. If you read Ecclesiastes backwards and start at the end of the book, you would maybe perceive it as so negative. But this is someone with experience that's tried a lot of different things. He's not writing as someone that, has a moral high ground over everyone else. This is someone who has made a ton of mistakes, who's writing this, I think, to try to help other people not fall into the same trap. What you got, Eric?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it would be a grab for sure. I mean, there's definitely a hook here. And in Florida, when I was younger, I don't know if they still do it, but in elementary school, they had a speech competition. It was called the Tropicana Speech Competition. And what you would do is all the kids would develop like a 3 to 5 minute speech. And you would do it in your classroom, and whoever was best from the classroom would end up competing in front of the school against the other classrooms. And so in fourth grade, I got first place in my classroom. So I went in front of the school. But a big part of that the teacher, reinforced to me, Mrs. Gonzalez, my fourth grade teacher, she said, you got to have a hook. You have to get people in. And so I had a speech about sharks. And so I used the musical notes from Jaws, because within the first 5 seconds, you know what the speech is going to be about. And everybody else, I remember everybody else used lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, like that was the opening speech for like everybody else. But I had the Jaws sound. And that's what's most memorable, is when you create something that people automatically know, hey, this is what he's talking about, or this is what she's talking about. And there, we could do that with all sorts of different things. If I said twinkle, twinkle, what's the first thing you guys think about?
Little star.
Little star.
Little story, yeah.
Yeah. If I was, again, you could say about any sort of song. I mean, if I mentioned an opening 80s lyric, Andrew, you probably would get it. Maybe 90s or 2000s, Chris would get it, but before me and you, Andrew. But it's this hook, right off the bat. It's vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And the person reading it's like, whoa, like, what's this guy talking about? Vanity of vanities. Of course, he's writing in a religious culture. They believe in one God. They're monotheistic. They believe in, God Yahweh, who's revealed himself in covenant to the people Israel. And so he's like, vanity of vanities. The person who's reading this, he must be talking about, worldliness. Right off the bat, the person knows in that culture. And I think, if we read Ecclesiastes before, maybe we read it backwards, what he's talking about. Life without God is a vapor of vapor. It's not even like a full vapor. Like it's the tail end of the vapor that just gone. It's nothing. And the great thing that Ecclesiastes explores is, at the end of the day, things on earth have no comparison to things above, and they have no meaning compared to things above. But when you have your priorities in the right place, then the things of this earth gain a degree of meaning. It's still nothing in comparison to, heaven and God and these sorts of things, but it gains some meaning to it. But if you don't have God in your life, then it doesn't matter. And I think that's what evolution does. I think really in the grand scheme of things, evolution is kind of like, well, be successful. Why? Make money. Why? Somebody else is going to take it when I'm dead. It doesn't come with me. So we have a lot of worldviews today that are all about make more money, do this, do that, have experiences, gain knowledge, do all these sorts of things. But if you don't have God in your life, it does not matter, because it will not last. Thieves break in and steal, moth comes in and devours, rust destroys. That's just the nature of things in this life. And in our class last night, one of our elders leading a class on 1 John, he talked about that idea that things break down. How many of us have our first car, or have the first pair of clothes we got, or have the first book we ever got. These sorts of things, they break down. And I think for a lot of people, alive today, they don't even have the first home that they were in. It's not even around anymore. The first church they went to is not around anymore. The things leave, things break down, things corrode and destroy. So if you don't have God in your life, then it doesn't matter. But if you do have God in your life, then it matters to a degree. And it's something that you can rejoice in insofar as God has blessed you with it.
Before we go on to the next section, just want to hone in one more time on that word king. This guy who's speaking has authority, and something that you should hopefully pay attention to and listen to. I'm not saying that kings can't do corrupt things, as Solomon was a corrupted king for a good part of his life. But what he had to say right here is very much what we need to give credence to. All right. We're going to see how much we can get through this next section, which is verse 3 through 11. We'll read it. Depending on how much we have to say, we may have to expound further next time, because there's a lot here, but this section is really all connected and is fought. So, Eric, if you would please read verses 3 through 11.
What profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south, and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually, and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor, man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. So, the overall message here is that, the earth keeps spinning on its axis. Andrew, you're kind of coping with that right now. Your aunt died, and it's a time of mourning, but the world keeps turning. The bill collectors, they still expect you to pay your bills. Your car is going to need gas. You need to go to work. You need to show up. If I've got kids, if something happens, my kids still need to eat. I can't just like huddle up in a ball and I might want to, but my kids still need to eat. And so the world keeps spinning on its axis. We use that even nowadays, thousands of years later, 3,000 years later, we still use this idea that even when catastrophes comes, things still need to be done. That things still continue going on. And he uses a lot of like, wind and water and, the sun. He's like, there's just this systematic cycle that just keeps going on and on and on. And he gets to the point where he starts talking about, you work and work and work, and guess what? There's still more work to be done. You try to establish a legacy, and the legacy squandered. You raise up children, and before you know it, you're gone. And your children are gone, and another generation is gone. Your parents are gone, grandparents are gone. And probably, just honestly, most of us couldn't name our great grandparents. Honestly, without them, we don't have existence. But people are forgotten. People are forgotten by and large. And even like the celebrities of history, a lot of things are forgotten about them too. It may be a couple of things that are remembered about them. Most people couldn't tell you much about George Washington, other than he's on the dollar bill, first president of the United States. That's probably about it for most people. Most people couldn't tell you, where he lived, what his estate looked like, children's names. Most people couldn't tell you anything about this guy, even though he's a sort of a celebrity of history. And if you're not a celebrity of the history, you don't even get that much. So that's kind of Solomon's point is, even from a king's perspective, you're going to be forgotten. You're going to be forgotten. And life will keep marching on. Life will keep moving on. There's nothing new under the sun. That's another kind of famous statement there in Ecclesiastes. And that's not to say like, okay, I talked to somebody recently and they're like, well, an iPhone's new. They didn't have iPhones back then. People communicate. That's just an expedience that's new, but the general idea of communication is not new. People struggling with lust. People in the ancient world weren't pulling up pictures of naked people on their phones, but they were doing other things that were trying to scratch that itch. So it's the same thing. It presents itself differently, but it's the same thing. People struggle with the same thing. They struggle with lying when it's uncomfortable to tell the truth. People try to take shortcuts in work. You think about a contractor nowadays, anybody who has a home realizes that contractors take shortcuts. It doesn't matter how good the contractor is, they're going to take a shortcut, and you're going to find out about that shortcut at some point. Solomon dealt with that kind of thing, again, 3,000 years ago. So there's nothing new under the sun in that respect. It's going to be the same old, and it becomes irritating and disheartening when you come to that realization and you see this sort of vanity of life. Things keep moving forward and it never seems satisfied. And the eye's not satisfied with seeing what it sees. The ear's not filled with what it hears. So again, it's just things keep going on, and nothing ever seems like it's being fulfilled. Nothing ever seems like it's being drained out or expunged or dealt with in sufficiency. Like, hey, we don't have to come back to this. I've noticed that with my house recently. I started kind of staining some chairs and get some chairs fixed up, and then we start having problems with our doors. And then I'm gonna have to fix the doors, and then we got another thing that's coming up, and I got probably a toilet seal to fix. It's just like it's just on and on and on, and it's just it's maddening. It becomes almost insanity. And I think that's what he's getting at is, if you don't have God in your life, then just this constant marching and marching and marching of life, it feels like you're being trampled on after a while. So you don't have God in your life, then you're gonna feel like that, and you're gonna be trampled on, and there's not gonna be any deliverance from that. But you got a God in your life, which he's not addressed yet. He's just getting the bad news out there before he gets to the good news. If you've got God in your life, then you can do those sorts of things, and you can see some degree of meaning in it, and press on and move forward. Chris?
When I read Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 3, what profit has a man from all of his labors? Makes me think of Mark chapter 8, verse 36, where Jesus says, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? So I almost wonder if Jesus, in a sense, is thinking of Ecclesiastes when he quotes that. I don't know. I can't say that for sure, but it reads very similarly. And I think they're both trying to get the same thought across. Solomon is saying, what profit do you have from all your labors? Like Eric said, and when you die, you can't take those things with you. So people will work and work and work and work on this earth and accumulate as many things as they can and still have a void. I mean, you think of how many celebrities have overdosed on whatever or committed suicide, and they have mansions and they have full bank accounts and they have the spouse they always wanted. I mean, you could go down the list, professional athletes, even just everyday people like us. All these people walk around with a void. And like I'd said, when you read this, like the first time I was reading this, I'm thinking he is being so just cynical, so negative. But the viewpoint of this is really going to make the difference in how you read it. One generation passes on, another generation comes. Um, that phrase in which he tolls under the sun mentioned 25 different times in Ecclesiastes. So it's a common phrase he's going to use. But to me, it's like Eric said, it's unending. Like we've talked in classes when we were going through the minor prophets, talk about how bad our world is today. Well, Solomon says there's nothing new under the sun. People have always been sinful. Maybe our access to sin has changed in ways, but people have always been sinful. This world's always been depressing. When Adam and Eve made that decision, that's when it all went downhill, and mankind has continued to go downhill and continued to choose to sin and continue to choose to rebel against God. God never meant for the physical to 100% satisfy us. If the jobs and the cars and the labor and the physical blessings of this life were meant to be all that satisfied us, we wouldn't need God. And you see from this mindset from Solomon here, he talks about nature, he talks about generations passing, he talks about labor, he talks about all kinds of different things and comes to the same conclusion about all of it. Vanity of vanities. It's meaningless without God. And you can go, I can point out periods of time in my life where I didn't maybe have a proper reverence for God and didn't have God in a proper place in my life. And it makes a difference. Even the smallest tasks that we do in our lives, the smallest thing you may think of doing, if you involve God in that process, it is so much more rewarding than with God outside of it. And you can involve God in everything that you do, how you treat people, how you labor as an employee, how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children, how you treat your brothers and sisters in Christ, how you evangelize, your own personal choices that you make. Everything doesn't have to be without meaning and without purpose. Even death has a purpose. Even grieving has a purpose. Even sorrow has a purpose. Our labors do have purpose and meaning and value, but it all comes with that proper perspective. And Solomon struggled in his life to get that proper perspective, and he knew better. His dad was a man after God's own heart. It's not like Solomon was raised by some heathen. He knew. And I think as we're going to see through the book, he loses his way, and he's trying to make his way back. And like I said, if you read it backwards, it makes it make a little more sense. If he came to that conclusion at the beginning of the book, you may view it a whole lot differently than you do with that conclusion being at the end. What you got, Andrew?
Just after looking at this book, I mean, we not too long ago actually went through Ecclesiastes here. One of our deacons did an in-depth study, and just further appreciation for this text. It's not like he's talking in code. He's getting to the points of where it should be very relatable to all of us, just the realities of this life. He's talking about all things in this section of earthly standpoint. He's not including that which is of the eternal, of the heavenly. Hence the word under the sun. What's happening right now? Like these fleeting lives. Remember what Moses ended up saying in Psalm 90, that our life is essentially 80 years at best, where our bodies eventually give out. So we have generations come and go, as it just mentioned. And then how much is reflected upon and remembered from those generations? Not a whole lot. There keeps on going. We just continue to move forward. The earth doesn't stop. Life doesn't stop, as we've already mentioned. But I like how he writes here, and you can really get an idea of just how well he was influenced by his father. And you see that you get a sense from the way he writes, just how his father sought to instruct him before he died, before David died, how he took his son Solomon under his wing to make sure he enforced certain ideals, certain ideas about how to live in this life. And we're going to get that more, as we've alluded to towards the end of the text. He's going to come back to the points of, you could see like how his father David instilled lifelong principles of how everyone is to live in order to make to the next life. But he does use the forces of nature, just kind of really give that idea of a better clarity of, you've as illustrations about the wind, the sun, and the rivers, the sea, and people would be able to understand that. He breaks it down to where you connect well with your audience, or you better get your audience attention by communicating in a way that they will understand what you're trying to say. So he does that. He uses examples where he's going to make sure that his audience understands what they're going to say. Just thinking about, he writing to initially a Hebrew audience, a Jewish audience. So they're going to understand what he is saying when he uses the forces of the various forces of nature. They're going to grab this and understand it. And then we make the personal application about how we are to live. And just this, as has been mentioned, that they kind of get that anchor point in verse 9, that there is nothing new under the sun. This idea of what's come before. You don't think that people have had issues before? You don't think that people have had to work for their lives or have had trials? Yeah, that has always been the case. You don't think that people have struggled with some sort of sin, that there's not been issues in the family before? He's going to get into that. He's going to present his example. And we keep in mind that, okay, how can this man I actually relate to me? You think about the writer being Solomon. He had everything that possibly anyone could ever want. So he could relate to having every type of care of this world made available to him in an instant. Can have anything he could ever want. So he can relate to having the riches of this life. And so very much he can relate to the highest, and then we will see he can also relate it to the lowest of the low. And that way we can say that this book, as we read it, is for anyone, everyone. You can make very much personalize it to myself. But as we, of course, read it, also remember that who's initially speaking to, and of course, then make it applicable to me. And he's just getting down to the facts of life. That's the way things have always been. Life will always be until the Lord comes back. There'll always be life issues, difficulties will arise. But people come, people go. He's more a matter of fact, putting it pretty much rather bluntly in this section. You're going to have work, and the time you spend here is very fleeting. You may try to fill yourself, but you won't. You ultimately won't be satisfied. You won't find ultimate fulfillment. You'll keep on trying to grab and grab and grab, but you'll never be filled under the sun, so to speak, in this temporal life. And he will continue to build this idea throughout this book of, when you try to attain fulfillment in this life, when you try to fill that void that only God can fill, you're never going to find it. And that's one of the biggest things, biggest things here. And so, any final thoughts before we close our discussion for today? I think we made a good introductory to this text, and hopefully have whet the appetite, so to speak, of what to expect of what Solomon has written for us. Anybody has any final thoughts?
I was thinking about what Chris said earlier about, you read in other places and you find out more about Solomon. And, one of the things about Solomon is he is the perfect candidate to write a book like this. Because nobody can say, well, he just didn't have enough. If he could just have maybe a little bit more, then he would have felt a little differently. He had everything. He had all the money. He had all the ladies. He had all the stuff. He had rulership. He had, treaties with other nations. He could travel if he wanted to, pretty much anywhere he wanted to go. First Kings also tells us about him importing like apes and stuff, and knowing all about plants and animals, and he's basically a scientist in the ancient world too. So he has all these things going for him. So he's the perfect candidate to write this book. He says, I had everything, but I didn't have God. So what I really had was nothing. If I have God, then I could have nothing else, and it would be everything. Chris?
1 Kings chapter 1 through chapter 12, 2 Chronicles chapter 1 through chapter 9. If you want to read more about Solomon to understand who we're talking about, those are good places to start. It's kind of like we said with Paul writing Romans. When you know more about Paul's background, it strengthens the letter itself. Him writing as a Jew of Jews, a Pharisee. When you learn more about Solomon and you see Solomon's shortcomings, it's like Eric had pointed out, wait a minute, this guy's got everything. How in the world can you say there's no purpose in life? You've had it all. There probably wasn't anything that he had that as king, there's probably nothing that he ever looked at or saw or thought about that he was probably ever told no. Like he had all the power in the world to pretty much do whatever he wanted to do. And he does do pretty much whatever he wants to do. And he comes to this conclusion. So like Eric said to me, it's like if you want someone, obviously Jesus knows everything, but he was without sin. If you want a sinful person who also asks for wisdom from God to write a book to kind of help us as we struggle with similar things, man, Solomon's a great choice. And the funny thing is if you really want to do something interesting, compare him with his dad. Him and David are obviously their father and son. They have similar struggles. But man, we see David fall off sometimes and stray and come back. Solomon goes way far away before he comes back. So that's also kind of an interesting parallel. But if you don't appreciate the Old Testament, I really hope that this study will get you to appreciate it more. Because if there's nothing new under the sun, and we have similar struggles to those of Solomon's day and Solomon himself, a lot of the advice he's going to give is going to be things that I think can help us too, kind of help our perspective. But really appreciated going through and looking at it. Already looking forward to next time.
Yeah, Solomon is laying out, you know what? I can relate with you, and hopefully you can take away some wisdom. I'm not a parent, but you just think about, Solomon, as he'll get through this, you don't have to do the things that I had done. I have experienced that kind of stuff. And I'm writing to you so you can understand where you can find life, or you could choose to live a certain way, and all you're going to find is emptiness, and it's just going to amount to nothing. And so we don't need to be striving after what can fill us in this life, because there's always going to be something lacking. We're always going to be wanting something more. And hopefully, as we read this, we'll all better understand if we have any type of void, we know where we can find it, and that is through God and searching his word, seeing that relationship with him. And that's what Solomon's ultimately pointing us to. He's going to walk us through what this life has to, quote unquote, offer, and ultimately where we find our true fulfillment, what's going to fill us all. And you can see that Solomon in this book, very much you get a lot of teachings that are foreshadowing of what Christ is going to point out. You see a lot of connections there. That's why it's said the Old Testament, points to Christ. And hopefully, as we unpack this book and as we study it, you'll see it. We'll better see it. But we hope that what we've talked about today has proved beneficial and helpful, not only to us, but to you. And we encourage you to seek and dig deeper into the Word of God. And as always, feel free to reach out to either one of us. Find Chris at the Shively Church of Christ Facebook page, or Eric or myself at the Taylorsville Road Church of Christ Facebook page, or at TaylorvilleRDChurchofChrist.com. We just want to make sure that we are all seeking that narrow path, which is going to lead us, each of us, to home of heaven. And we thank you for tuning in, and we hope, Lord willing, that you'll plan on tuning in next week, when we will continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And until then, may God bless you and take care.